In this short lecture, I would like to discuss Buber's Theopolitics as an act of resistance. I hope that my words are also of actuality and importance for the present day situation in Israel. Shortly after Hitler's takeover of power, Buber writes to his publisher Lambert Schneider that publishers and writers have to learn now to live in catacombs. Writers will have to write in such a way that the rulers do not immediately perceive their resistance. From 1933 until his arrival in Jerusalem in March 1938, Buber coped with the harsh reality of Buber's politics. His engagement in Jewish adult education was already an act of resistance. His literary production of that period is a protest and a cry for an alternative society and politics. Buber's texts from 1933 until March 1938 reflect his reaction to the folkish ideology of Germany. His literature of resistance objected an exclusivist identity politics and a political theology. It aimed at the elimination of a pathological hyper-nationalism and an authoritarianism that destroyed the equality of all. I argue that Buber's writings in the 30s are an act of resistance, and that in a broader sense is consistent political resistance before, in and after that period appears in many of his writings that belong to different scholarly disciplines. A holistic reading of all these interrelated writings allows us to rediscover Buber as an eminent political thinker resisting a politics disconnected from ethics. Although there has been some early attention to Buber's prophetic politics, for instance in Paul Mendes-Floor's oeuvre, research on Buber's theopolitical thinking has been a rather neglected field. Only recently, publications give due attention to Buber as a political thinker who protests a political theology. Scholars such as Sam Brody, Christoph Schmidt, and Charles Lesch focus on Buber's critique of Carl Schmitt's political theology and on Buber's theopolitics in Königtum Gottes, which challenges Schmitt's friend Fu politics. Just as Levinas's political theory was discovered in his Talmudic writings and rather than in his philosophy, one discovered Buber's political stance in his exegetical work. Against Schmitt as the crown jurist of the Third Reich, who divinized the earthly dictator and secularized theological concepts in the service of politics, Buber retained the nomadic ethos of pre-monarchic Israel. And his protest against the instrumentalization of religion in function of the authoritarian state, he followed the anti-monarchic position of the judges Gideon and Shmuel and of the prophets. Sam Brody has written an excellent book on Buber's anarchist Theopolitics, which contests a fascist political theology that puts the divine in service of political power. He notes that Buber has been received mostly as a philosopher or theologian. In his view, Buber's Theopolitics is better accounted for through a combined reading of his writings on the Bible, together with his explicit political thinking in Past in Utopia and his occasional writings on Zionism. Brody utters his suspicion that reading Buber's politics in terms of his dialogical philosophy explains why he is relatively absent from political conversations today. I suggest rather that what prevented scholars to discover Buber's political thinking is that he was classified as an unrealistic, merely religious thinker. However, for Buber, religion was primarily an exemplary dialogical life. It penetrated all spheres of life, including the political one. Buber opposed the privatization of religion and the instrumentalization of it in the service of politics. With his humanist and social concept of religion, he became an active resistor swimming against the tide. A close reading of the broad range of his writings reveals that the first president of the Israel Academy for Sciences and Humanities was a prominently political thinker. A new scholarship discovers Buber's Counterculture and Resistance in Königtum Gottes, published in 1932. Divine kingship was not theocracy or divine kingdom, but a unified reality in which the religious and the political were interlaced. Buber's Jewish messianism aims at the realization of the relation between God and the world through the insertion of unity in the world. His biblical writing was never purely religious, since he did not separate the holy from the profane. There was a tension, not a separation. It has been remarked that Carl Schmitt is not mentioned in Königtum Gottes, but when one reads the book in light of Buber's 1936 article, The Question to the Single One, Schmidt's fingerprints are all over the text. Indeed, Buber's essay sheds a retrospective light on Königtum Gottes. The essay attacked Schmidt's anti-liberal authoritarian politics of power and was a courageous act of resistance. It offers Buber's view on the single one as a responsible human being in an anarchic community. The human being's nature was evil, but not absolutely. The state was necessary and problematic. The Question to the Single One is the only place where Buber openly refers to Schmitt, who became famous, or rather infamous, in the 20s and the 30s. With Carl Schmitt, who claimed that the essence of politics was the capacity to define the friend and the enemy, Jews quickly became a scapegoat as threatening the German cohesion. The Question to the Single One certainly sheds light on Königtum Gottes and clearly shows Buber as a political thinker. Yet, already in I and Thou 1923, Buber deems that politics is subservient to the spirit and linked to human relations. I quote, "The economy as the house of the will to profit and the state as the house of the will to power participate in life as long as they participate in the spirit." Unquote. In this passage, Buber clearly designs a dialogical community characterized by equality and lack of domination and exploitation. Asaf Ziderman rightly defines Buber's dialogical thought as a philosophy of action. He further notes that one cannot bracket the dialogical principle to explicate Buber's Theopolitics. Buber is indeed a hedgehog in Isaiah Berlin's terminology. He knows one single thing: dialogue or interconnectedness, which appears in his entire oeuvre. Buber's political philosophy is dialogical in that it responds to a given situation, starting from one's all undivided being. Brody briefly suggests that a reintegrating of Buber's philosophical anthropology and his theopolitics will certainly bear fruits for the future. But his own bracketing of Buber's philosophy of dialogue to elaborate his theopolitics, by doing this, by bracketing, he leaves me some work to do. I argue that Buber's dialogical philosophy and his theopolitics cannot be separated, and that is exactly what I want to show. Against the dichotomist thinking characteristic for populists with their rhetoric of alternative facts, Buber's transformational thought reflects his profound belief in dialogue between people and in a true community that does not pursue a coercive power politics. To create a new we, he opposes a politics that distinguishes between friends and foes. In dialogical communities, individualism as an I without a thou, and collectivism as a thou without an I, could be overcome. Against an ethnic nationalism, Buber developed an inclusive attitude that made coexistence and mutuality between the I and the thou possible. Of course, his writings on Zionism remain crucial in rediscovering Buber's anarchistic political thought. In a today most actual critique of nationalistic perspectives, and of a politics that is based on the people's fears. Buber represented a moral Zionism that cares for the Arabs in the land. His theology of the land is not a divinization of it, but in function of Israel's ethical mission. In his 1944 lectures published in On Zion bin Am Laatzo, both the land and the people are in the perspective of the realization of an ethical society. Their election was not ontological but ethical. Politics should not be cut off from religion, conceived as ethics. The focus in recent scholarly literature on Buber's Theopolitics in Königtum Gottes and the question to the single one, and in his Zionist writings, is certainly useful to draw the attention to Buber as a political thinker. But Theopolitics as a combination between politics and ethics are present in many other writings of Buber. Given the unity in Buber's work, his philosophy, his translation project, his so-called religious writings, his Zionist thoughts, his exegetical work, as well as his reimagination of Hasidism, are all closely linked and offer us a coherent, combined picture of Buber as a political resistor. A few examples will suffice in order to demonstrate how Buber, in many of his writings, not only in the period between 33 and 38, resists an autonomous, autarkic politics devoid of ethics. With their formal equivalent translation of the Bible, Buber and Rosenzweig strive to revive the Gesprochenheit of the biblical word. They wanted the biblical word to speak to Jews and Christians in Germany. Through their work on the Bible, they opposed Marcionite tendencies and decried anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. According to Buber, the political theologian William Stapel opposed their translation out of fear that, I quote, the mere dissemination of the actual scriptures undermines the effort to theologically legitimate state violence. In his article Biblischer Humanismus, published in Der Morgen in October 1933, Buber opposes the Greek concept of the word in the polis as above the problems of the day with a Hebrew understanding of the word, which is to be listened to and made true in the Edah, in the community. Responding to the biblical word was a therapy for people of this time who had forgotten interrelatedness and dialogue. Tanakh was not Biblia, belonging to the it world, but Mikra, a living word that had to be listened to and to be answered by returning in hallowing daily life. Not catastrophic overturning and political revolution, but slowly and consistent turning was needed. Against Plato, who approached the truth as a preconceived idea of an unfolding idea that can be remembered, Buber maintained that the prophets criticized the existing society in view of improving it. With his criticism of politics from an ethical religious viewpoint, Buber remained critical of religions, separated from ethics. This stance is central in his literature of resistance. Religion had become separated from reality itself. Above all, it had compromised itself with Nazi politics. It had forgotten to relate to this messy world in which unity had to be realized against the Marcionite rejection of the world. In an article of 1936, Buber complains that religion has become part of the detached spirit. The Hebrew Bible had become religious writing, something pious or scientific, not compromising anymore the whole of life. Cure the chasm between the scriptures and the human being of today, one had to start experiencing revelation. The biblical word was a voice through which one becomes metamorphized dialogical. Against the absolutization of politics, Buber maintained that spirit and concrete life, the holy and everyday life, belong together. In a prophetic perspective, the politics of Israel was theopolitics. For Buber, the horrible events of the 30s were the result of reviving Gnostic ideas. He felt that the unity between the spiritual and the worldly order was broken. In a clear act of resistance he published in 1933 his essay The Faith of Judaism. He analyzes there how in his days the Old Testament was rejected as the result of a long process, starting with the evangelist John and Marcion and continuing with Adolf von Harnack, who stamped the preservation of the Old Testament as a consequence of religious and ecclesiastical paralysis. Safely arriving in Jerusalem in 1939, Buber blames Marcion's dualistic thinking as destructive for Israel. Von Harnack, he now openly says, continued Marcion's messianic thought that negated the world, preparing in this way the domain for Hitler's actions against the Jews. In Buber's messianism, on the contrary, a person takes upon himself responsibility in relating to the world that may be repaired and redeemed. Messianism was the restoration of God's kinship after it had been lost. Tikkun olam, the mending of the world, was possible and necessary. Not only in his reflections on Judaism and on the Jewish Bible, but also in his writings on Hasidism, Buber reveals himself a political thinker. Inspired by this popular movement, he desired to hallow everything, including the political sphere. In what Mendelssohn calls a non-noetic conception of faith, Buber frequently uses the term Bewährung, putting to prove in action. Spirituality as a realization of unity and to be verified in daily life, including in the political realm. Whereas Ratzabi and Brody focused on Buber's theopolitics and biblical exegesis, Yemima Haddad extends their arguments towards Buber's approach of Hasidism by characterizing Buber's approach of biblical and Hasidic myths as a misactivism. Buber inserted ethics in the biblical and Hasidic myths. He restrained, I quote, the folkish forces of myth to champion a nationalism whose universalist worldview echoed Hasidism's ideal theopolitical community, unquote. Whereas Nazi and folkish ideologies rejected ethics as a Jewish invention, Buber resituated ethics in a mythical framework. Finally, in his writings on and to Gandhi, Buber is again a religio-political thinker. Significantly, his Gandhi die Politik und Wir, which first appeared in 1930, was reprinted as an annex to Die Frage an den Einzelnen in 1936. Buber much appreciates Gandhi's non-violence, but also criticizes it, because Gandhi did not enough distinguish between religion as orienting goal and politics, which remain a means. Against the British colonialists, Gandhi wanted political successes and independence, Swaraj, as soon as possible. His famous Salt March in 1930 was a pilgrimage with political intent. Buber, for his part, retained a permanent tension between religion and politics. The political serpent, he writes, is not essentially evil, it is itself only misled. Ultimately, it wants to be redeemed. Prophetic religion as orientation is never completely realized. It is an infinite goal. Buber viewed Gandhi as a prophetical figure whose experiments made the divine manifest, but his mission had a tragic character. The unconditionality of the spirit and the conditionality of the masses clashed. Nevertheless, Buber admired Gandhi's ahimsa as the non-violent promotion of life. His refusal of the Schmittian political theology of sovereignty and his shaping of a dialogical society were not far from Gandhi's experiments. Both Buber and Gandhi strive for an egalitarian, non-hierarchical and non-violent society. They both fought against imperialism and domination. 9 years later, reacting to Gandhi's unfamous letter on the Jews of 26 November 1938, Buber refuses Gandhi's advice to the Jews to become satyagrahis. In reference to the Bhagavad Gita, Buber opts to fight for justice, but to fight lovingly. Further in his letter, Buber tried to convince the Mahatma, who did not favor the Jewish immigration to Palestine, that Jews and Arabs could live together in service of the land. with his thoughts on the renewal of Judaism, on an utopian socialism, and on freedom and non-coercion under the divine kingship, cooperation was possible and necessary. Before and after World War II, Buber and Gandhi wanted a state that intervenes as little as possible in the lives of people. In their active, non-violent resistance, they were critical of the abuse of power by the state. I conclude that Buber in the period from 1933 until 1938 developed a resistance literature. Yet, in many of his writings before, in and after that period, he opposed an autonomic politics unlinked to a dialogical ethics. He refused to separate politics and religion or ethics in all his writings. The prophetic religious political voice promoted alliances between people in small anarchistical communities. In the kingdom of God, all spheres of life, including the political one, had to be hallowed. Buber listened to a voice that had to resonate in his world. One had to live in this world with a kind of otherworldliness. In Selma Lagerlöf's phrasing, the real statue, whose kingdom is not of this world, cannot be replaced by the fake statue, whose kingdom is only of this world. In his humanistic, unromantic, and non-mystic religiosity, Buber wrote in I and Thou, I quote, "World here, God there, that is ito, and God in the world, that too is ito. But leaving out nothing, leaving nothing behind, to comprehend all the world, and comprehending the you, giving the world its due and truth, to have nothing besides God, but to grasp everything in Him, that is the perfect relationship." Unquote. Politics had to contribute to the birth of the Zwischenmensch. Against domination, exploitation, and sovereignty, the relation to the Arabs as equal to the Jews in a land that was commonly owned was part and parcel of Buber's egalitarian, socialist, and moral Zionism. In his resistance to a dominating, exploiting, and aggressive Zionism, he was ready to accept the accusation that he was a traitor, what one calls today, denigratedly, an anarchist. Buber was a political thinker, a resistor to reactionary forces, a fighter for equality and human rights, not only in his exegesis, but also in his dialogical philosophy, in his view on Christianity and Judaism, in his translation project with Rosenzweig, and in his creative reinterpretation of Hasidism. He opposed the Augustinian-like separation between the city of God and the city of man and the libertarian Zweirichtlehre. Religion and life were inseparably connected. Ethics and politics were linked. In his utopian vision, there was no separation between the holy and the profane, but the tension remained. I deem that there is a need to revisit Buber's entire oeuvre in a holistic reading to fully grasp his positional relation between politics and ethics and his sustainable and coherent resistance to an autarkic politics.